The Center for Procurement Excellence is a nonprofit member organization with a mission of educating, promoting, and advocating for better RFP processes. Join CPE today and make your RFPs faster and more transparent. Membership also includes discounts to all of our training and networking events. CPE hosts a variety of virtual and in-person networking and training events throughout the year. Visit our website to get signed up. CPE Speakers Bureau is available for your regional and national meetings and professional conferences. Contact us to learn more.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
Okay, well, that said, let's go ahead and dive into this month's topic, data analytics for procurement professionals. Now, if you work with data, then maybe some of this is familiar, but my experience has been that a lot of folks don't normally work in this sector from a procurement standpoint, and how do we use analytics, what does that even mean, and hopefully we'll provide some value to as we go through this here. So we're going to go through and discuss data analytics and how that works. We'll talk about visual analytics, how we can apply those to our procurement practices, and hopefully at the end of the day, provide something that helps people make decisions for what they're looking at. And that's really the point when we think about data analysis, and what we do with that, that's the fundamental intent of this, is to help us make better, wiser decisions. So when you think about data analytics and what that entails, there's a couple of definitions to kind of think about with this, right? So let's start off with a simple definition here, right? Using data, statistical and quantitative analysis, and out of the models, our goal here is to help drive decisions and actions based on what we're looking at, right? So we actually have, as procurement professionals, we have access to a lot of data. And I would say, frankly, that we don't always maximize its full potential based on the data set that we have available to us. We go through different things, we look at different tools, but we don't actually do something with the data that we have at our fingertips here. So we have this data, and the intent with this in today's presentation is to take different analytical tools to help us, at the end of the day, provide knowledge that allows us to do something with that information, right? So there's three levels of analytics, and we have to ask ourselves, where does our organization stand and what can we do with them, right? So the first group, there's different studies that look at this. About 34% of most organizations are at what we call the analytically beginners, right? They rely on management experience, it's focused primarily on cost cutting, and there's not a whole lot of analytical skills or capabilities that are present when we think about this. The next group of people, about 54%, are practitioners where they collect the data. They may apply some simple analytics, and again, they're mostly relying on that data to help understand what's going on here. And finally is what we call analytical innovators. And what this is heavily reliance on data to drive decisions as to what we're meant to do. Now, our intent of this is not to say that data is the end-all be-all here, but what we are advocating for is that we can use data to help us make better decisions for what we're looking to do. My experience at most procurement is kind of in this realm here. We have data, but we're not exactly sure what to do with it. So when we think about different kinds of data analysis, there's a couple different ways to think of it. There's really three main categories. There's descriptive data. In other words, that describes what happened previously. So an example of that is last year, we conducted 95 procurements for a total dollar value of this amount of money. That would be descriptive data about historically what you've done in the past. Predictive data means not just last year, but take the last, let's say, 5 years and look at the trends in terms of if you're doing volumes of procurement, you can now use the historical trends to predict out, well, what does our future might look like from that standpoint. Predictive. It's using historical more than one data point over a period of time to understand what's the future going to look like. Prescriptive analysis, and that's the most advanced, but that's also the most useful, is to, based on all the criteria that we tell our analytics tools, what's going to happen in the future. Now, when we talk about that, when we think about that, what that requires us to have here is to make some assumptions about what our data is going to happen, right? So when you go to online and you're looking at different tools like the housing market, for example, there are tools out there that predict the cost of housing into 2023. Now, there's other things that we might consider that. What's one of the major things we think about when we trying to predict housing prices? Everybody saw what happened yesterday? Everybody see what happened to the federal government? Is they raised the interest rates, right? They raised the interest rates by half a point. And so obviously we can predict out for the future that is going to have an impact on the future of housing prices. So they use these different inputs like interest rates, demand for housing to predict out what that's going to look like, right? For procurement, we can look at different things in terms of the supply chain impacts that we might be having. We can look at just the overall interest level in the contractors. In fact, we have a presentation that maybe we should do here at RFP Doctor one day, but we have collected significant data about the construction workforce and the different supply chain impacts. And what this tells us here, in fact, one of the most interesting data that we just came across here, like the last couple of weeks, is that if you look at the birth rates I think it's focused on the United States, but globally, the birth rates have been at their lowest level in 120 years. Now think about that. Kind of walk this through here what that means. If the birth rates are low, and we know that we have very limited workforce in construction, that means that over the next 10 to 15 years, our workforce challenges are going to persist. As much as we don't like to think about it, that's what the data is telling us, right? So I digress a little bit here, but that's when we think about different types of analytics here. Is descriptive, what happened previously. Predictive is looking at multiple points of time to understand what might happen. And prescriptive is putting various types of data into our models to tell us what is going to happen into the future. Again, most procurement, most folks are kind of in the descriptive range, and that's okay. Okay. So let's kind of shift gears here for a moment and think about visual analytics and what that means and how that can be useful for us, right? So imagine you have a database which is full of data. So you have maybe a bunch of RFPs, the timelines, the budgets, types of projects, different things like that. Our goal here is to somehow tell a story based on that data, to tell people that based on the data we have here, this is what's happening, and this is our interest in our particular situation, right? One way to do that is through data visualization, where you take your pile of data and you form it and you present it in a way that people can understand what might be happening with them, right? Data visualization. There's lots of tools that can make that happen. What happens a lot of the time, though, is that we use different models that will tell us what's going to happen. Now, we're not going through the details, that's okay, but we have models, mathematical models, that can take all that data and therefore tell us a story. Now, most of us here, in fact, myself included, if I look at these two options where I have data visualization versus complicated mathematical models, my preference is to work on this left-hand side. It's much easier for us to communicate and understand what's happening if this is the type of data we're looking at. If people have an emotional connection to what we're telling them from a data standpoint, that is significantly more effective. In fact, there is psychology out there that if you want people to change or to do something different, there's two main things you have to connect with them on. Two things. The first one is pleasure. We have to convince them that by making this change, their lives will be better, happier, more pleasurable, right? That's the first one. The second one is through pain. If people are not feeling pain, they're not likely to motivate to do something different, right? So through this perspective and think about data visualization and presenting data that helps us understand what's happening, that's how we go through and think about that. So different ways to do that. At the end of the day here, our goal is to get to visualizations, right? That's our goal here, to tell a credible story about a real world data problem. That's our goal. That's what we need to think about is how do we tell a story and connect with people on an emotional level based on the types of data that we're having here, right? We didn't think today would be a psychology discussion, but that's what this is, right? So when we think about visual analytics here, there's a couple of ways we can use this in our profession, right? It's decision making. What I have found that working with executives, by far the best way to convince people to do something, it has some sort of powerful graphic that explains, here's what we need to do, here's the situation. If we find that people have to spend time thinking about what the data is telling them, it's most likely not going to be a good meeting. You want people to look at something and not make what we might call decisions. They see something, it's obvious, we move forward. That's the goal here, right? Understand the risk, and therefore we can make better, more strategic decisions based on that, right? So let's think about our potential audiences, right? Let's say you're presenting in front of a large audience with lots of people. A single graphic that somehow communicates what we're looking to do here is the intent, right? At the end of the day here, our goal is to have an experience for people can look at this and then say to themselves, wow, this is incredible. This is the type of thing that we want to do here. People have a positive experience, a wow factor for what's going on here, right? Now, if we have a smaller meeting of a limited group of people, this idea of having the more detailed information is more of the aha experience, right? So think about that. If we're with a large group of people, the wow factor is far more important. If you're meeting on one-on-one with a person or a small group of people, the more inquisitive, like, now I understand what's happening here, is a more important perspective as we think about this. So here's an example. So in 2015, there was a journalist with the Wall Street Journal, and they were looking at the effects of vaccinations on overall health and safety. So this person, Tyan DeBold, they looked at measles, right? So if you just look at the data here, before 1963, so between 1926 and 1963, there's a total of 17 million cases of measles. From 1963 to 2015, there's 1.7 million cases. So obviously in 1963, there's a measles vaccine and that have a positive impact, right? So you can tell people this is a factual statement. Everything I just walked with you, these numbers here, 1963, after, that is all factual information. But does it connect to us on an emotional level? Think about it. It probably doesn't, right? Or it takes some effort, right, to get us to do something based on that. Compare that to this. If we had the same data here, but you presented this from a visual standpoint. On the left-hand side here, these red and yellow, those are high cases by state. On the right-hand side, this is no cases, right? So there's basically no colors over on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, lots of cases, right? So this is a visual standpoint to how to communicate to people that there is a change that happened and this is the impact, right? It's a visual representation of what's actually going on with that here. Now, let's take this a step further. Here's another is why visually looking at our data is also helpful for us, right? So in this data set here, I have 3 organizations. We have organization A, and we have the average change order rate of these organizations is at 10%, right? Organization B, their average change order rate is also 10%. And finally, C, theirs is also at 10%. Now, when you look at this data, the first thing, this is not a trick, right? This is, let's call it real data here. I'm not making up the numbers here. And when you look at this, it appears that if you're assuming that change orders are a way to measure performance in our organizations, these 3 organizations are the same. There's a correlation between cost and time, right? But this 10% across the board here. Is this the full story as to what's going on? Or in other words, feel free to type in the chat box here, but in other words, what else might we be interested in to understand how similar these organizations are? Are they actually the same? Well, the next thing we should be thinking about here is, well, if I were to plot their data on a chart, what might it look like? So for example, we take organization A, we plot their data, this is what we see here. So we say as time goes on, cost goes up for whatever the project might be, and this is a very, very well-distributed set of data. Like this red line here, this is called our best fit line. Clearly, that when you plot all the data points, this clearly shows that those 2 factors, time and cost, are related to each other, right? Let's go to organization B. Look at this, right? Now, this has the same best fit line based on the set of data here, but would you call these 2 organizations the same? Absolutely not, right? The projects are different. Something is going on here, and especially look at this guy over here. There's an outlier here that is way far outside the data that's affecting how we might be looking at this. Or in other words, if you were to draw a line on this chart here, if you were to just visually thinking about this line, ignoring that outlier, probably goes something more like this, right? But because we have this outlier over here, that changes the slope of the line, and so therefore we can't do anything, or it masks what's actually going on here. And finally, organization C. Again, the same fit line, the same change order rate, same correlations here. But if you look at this organization, what do we see going on here? What this tells us here that if this is like project days or procurements, there's different types of projects that are being grouped together here based on the outcomes. Without visually looking at this data here, it's hard for us to truly understand the nature of what's going on. So for example, if you were doing this on your own projects and you had a bunch of procurement data you were looking at, if you saw procurements and your data kind of looked like this chart over here, my guess is that these are different types of procurements. So maybe services versus construction versus other types of projects maybe have different outcomes in terms of how those projects perform. So for that reason, visually looking at our data to help us understand what's going on is one important tool. Now, there are mathematical metrics that you can look at that helps us understand what's going on from a mathematical standpoint, from a number standpoint. But what I have found that visually looking at the data is a far more effective way for us just to get a feel for what's going on there, right? The plots, the graphics tells us a different story, right? Different stories, different data. Clearly, there's different things going on here. Now, here's one more. This is a real life example. Everybody remember the Challenger disaster when the spaceship blew up, right? It's a disaster, terrible thing, and they obviously want to know what happened, right? So, 1986, the shuttle took off. It exploded on takeoff. The cause, for those of you that may not know, is because of the O-rings between the fuel cells. When they get cold, they get brittle, and that means fuel can go between the different tanks, and it caused it to explode, right? Because of cold weather, right? So that's what they figured out. So what they did here is they want to know, well, why did that happen? How do we now know about it? And let's investigate. So they brought in the physicist Feynman. He's famous and has done a bunch of different things. And he's the one who realized that because of the weather, that has an impact on the O-rings, right? Now, here's how this ties to visual analytics. What had happened is that when they looked at the previous launch data for the space shuttles, is that they had organized this data by launch number, meaning the sequence of those launches. So the first launch, followed by the second launch, by the third launch, and that's how they plotted their data. Well, what they realized is that how they looked at it by temperature, they would have seen that there's failure points that based on this temperature level on the left-hand side of this chart here, is that it would have likely failed. But they didn't look at it from a visual standpoint of what the actual temperatures were when they launched, and otherwise they would have realized what the potential impact is by looking at it from that standpoint here, right? So having that visual data would have been useful here, right? Here's one final example to help us hopefully communicate the power of visual analytics here. Visual data. How many sixes do you see in this chart? How many sixes? Count them up. Yeah, I didn't do this ahead of time here, right? This is hard. I mean, I'm getting confused myself here looking at it. Compared to something like this. How many sixes? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Simple example here, right, folks? But I tell you what, when you visually communicate your data, it helps people pick up on trends significantly faster, right? That's the goal of that. Good job, Jeff. Margaret, good job for everybody else that got that. Nadine, that's okay. That's 6. Yeah, really, really interesting, right? Now, I said one more picture. What's wrong with this picture here, right? Now, this is not a political statement, folks. It doesn't matter where this came from here, but think about this picture. This is in 2012, the percentage of people that would vote for different presidential candidates, right? This is a pie chart. Pie charts are meant to add up to 100%. Now, what they did here is the data I think is probably correct, but the way they showed that is not correct. In fact, this is just a word of advice here. Don't use pie charts. Pie charts are terrible. They're really difficult to understand. Now, unless it's Thanksgiving, pie charts, in my view, don't have a whole lot of use, right? So just keep that in mind. By the way, the best kind of pie is chocolate pie. Just so we're clear on that. I'm just kidding here. Just kidding. Okay. So what are some metrics that we can use from procurement? RFI response times. Now, sometimes we might collect all of our questions and just answer at the end, that's fine. But if you answer questions as they come in, it might be interesting to track how much time it takes us to respond to those questions. Or more importantly, after the contract has been signed and we're going through like design on a construction project, how much time is there between when we ask a question and when the questions get answered? That might be a useful piece of information. The average number of proposers from your projects. So on average, how many procurement people do actually submit proposals on your projects? And if you track that over time, that's useful. And if you track it over time and by project type, that's really useful. If you see a declining trend in your markets, then that should prompt us to say, well, what in the world is going on here? Is it supply chain? Is it workforce? Or is it people have had some really bad experiences with our organization and therefore we need to think about it, right? Number 3 here, client customer satisfaction. How often after the procurement is done do you reach out to your end users and say, hey, what did you think about a 1 to 10 scale, the overall experience on this procurement? I'm not saying do a big giant survey here, just ask them 2 questions, 1 to 10 satisfaction, and second question is, would you do this again? Yes or no? That's it. And if you don't have that type of data, it might be worth it to at least start asking about that, right? Industry feedback. After the procurements are done, maybe you offer a debriefing. How often do you do a survey of your vendors to just get an overall feel of what what they think about us as a company, as an organization, right? That can be another useful thing. The final thing here is a little bit more effort, I would say, but I think is very powerful, is the overall quality of your statement of work or your RFP. Now, CPE, for those that attend our virtual workshops, we provide a tool that helps us put a number to the overall quality of our statements of work. But I encourage you to go through after you've done certain types of RFPs to evaluate that and put a measure or a metric on that to say, what is this good, is this not good? Having post evaluations on our quality statements of work can be a really powerful tool to think about that. So as we kind of wrap this up here, to kind of think about this and maybe how you go forward in your own organizations, the last thing I want to talk about here is what types of data do we want to consider? Now, this is a little bit technical here, but the reason I want to talk about this is because this can help us plan for what do we need to think about, all right? There's qualitative data and there's quantitative data, right? So when we look at qualitative data or categorical data, some of these things are what is called Boolean, which means true or false. Either you do it or you don't do it, all right? Either the procurement was released on time or it wasn't. We used budget or we didn't use budget. That's what we mean by Boolean, yes or no. There's ordinal, which is ranked data. So like level of satisfaction, if you do a 1 through 5 scale, that is ordinal data, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have nominal data, which means it's unordered, unranked. So that's like colors, directions, days of the week. I mean, that's kind of ordered depending on where your start point is. Different things that you can look at, right? There's text, which is narrative, words, paragraphs, things like that. And then finally, location. On the right-hand side, we have quantitative data, continuous. So what do you mean by that is like 2.457, 4.2, 3.5, things like that. That's continuous or discrete, right? Discrete data means it's in order, it's specific, but like shoe sizes, for example. I'm a size 12, but there's 11.5, there's 11, that's discrete data that has specific buckets to it. Now, okay, back up here. Why is this important to us? Why do we talk about types of data? You can do more powerful analytics, visual analytics with this type of data, with quantitative data. You can do more predictions with this type of information on the right-hand side. However, getting this type of data, this quantitative data, is very costly. And costly in terms of time and effort to collect that information. On the left-hand side, it's easier to collect this, but you can't do as much predictions based on this type of data. It takes a lot more work to do predictive analysis using qualitative data. So I just encourage you to think about how you're going to do that and what type of data you might collect as you go forward and plan about this. There are different tools out there that can make this. There's Tableau, there's RStudio, there's Power BI, there's all sorts of different tools. In fact, it's getting a little bit late here. I was going to do a demo of Tableau with some facilities data that's all built out in Tableau that shows how we do different visual analytics, but there's lots of tools out there. But at the end of the day here, when you think about whatever tool you're using, the intent of this is to allow us to go through and understand visually what's happening. So hopefully with today's presentation, then the main takeaway is to collect data, to do something with that, and hopefully we can help people make better decisions based on the type of data that we're looking at.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.